right, everybody. So we started talking about DNA last time, and so it just sort of naturally progresses to a combination of the actual chemistry of the DNA and then the chemistry of translating out the DNA and how that actually expresses itself in the final organism. So we talked about how DNA codes for proteins, and DNA is the building blocks in the, well, amino acids are the building blocks. So DNA is the instructions for all of the things that the body needs. So let's talk about what that really actually means, okay? We know the chemistry of how it's put together, but let's talk about how the translations come out as well. Okay, so you can see here we're talking about heredity and genetics. It's got a little kind of wiggly sort of outline here. Let's see if that shows up. Yep, all right. So, I've been having technical difficulties, so apologies for if this does not come out as clear or concise as I would like it. All right, so let's talk about genetics. Genetics here is the study of how genes interact and how traits are passed down from parent to offspring, okay? So genetics is actually the study of the genes themselves. I'm going to underline that as well. It's the actual genes themselves. Now, if you look here at the bottom, the passing of traits from one generation to the next is called heredity. Now, how is that different? Because they sound really, really similar. Okay, so if we're looking at genetics, it's like we're looking at the map. Okay? And we're seeing all the ways that things could go. Okay? And when we're talking about heredity, we're actually not looking at a map. We're looking at a path laid out on the map. Okay? Now, different things can be hereditary. They can be hereditary because of genetics, hair color, eye color, all sorts of things like that, height, weight, etc. But also things that can be hereditary are emotional things too, psychological things. So you can inherit, a really good work ethic, or you can inherit the tendency to spend too much time in front of the TV or stuff like that, just depending. So we use these words a little bit differently, and we're just going to talk about the scientific side of both of these words, okay, and the definitions therein. Okay, so traits and alleles. This is our first heading here. Okay, genetic traits include essentially every characteristic about an organism. It says some of the most observable traits in humans include hair, eye, and skin color, as well as height. Okay, so that's something, when we're talking about the most observable, that's something that you're going to notice right away. For instance, if you look at me, you will notice that I have brown hair, at least mostly. I have blue eyes. I have very, very light skin, and I have very, very little height. I am very short. So all of this stuff is programmed into my genetic instructions, okay? But other traits are more behavioral, such as sleep cycles, aggression, and other instincts, okay? So you can sort of have some behavioral stuff passed down, like I was talking about earlier when you talk about things being hereditary, things being inherited from family members in your bloodline, or even just people you were around a good deal that were part of your family, okay? All right, so these are what we would call traits, okay? And so these are expressions of these genes or this heredity. Sorry. So let's talk about the allele, though. Okay, it's a really funny word. I've got a definition here in this little pink-looking gemstone thing. Allele, one form or variation of a gene, one version of a gene. Okay. A gene is a segment of a chromosome, and we'll see pictures of this, but lots of chromosomes look sort of wiggly like this, sort of make an X shape. Ooh, all right, now this right here, this is some, there you go, this is some really, you know, like high quality artwork here, so print this off and frame it. I'll sign it for you. All right, so we would have little portions on here. The part of the chromosome that contains different instructions would be the allele, okay? A gene is a segment of a chromosome encoded by DNA. Genes come in pairs called alleles. And each allele is a variation of that gene. If one of the genes or alleles is more powerful, there we go, more powerful than the other, it can cover up the traits of the weaker allele, okay? So, what does that mean? All right, you have options a lot of times when you get genetics, when you get to talking about genetics. So, let's talk about, this is in the blue box here. We've got dominant allele and recessive allele. Dominant allele, the allele that is always expressed, if it is there. Okay? Recessive allele, the allele that can be masked by the dominant allele, only expressed when both alleles are recessive. Okay. So, if we have something that is dominant, if we have a trait that is dominant, we refer to that as being the stronger allele. Okay, and so if we have a recessive, well, then we say that that's a weaker allele. It's recessive. Okay, now, as a general rule, lighter colors are recessive to darker colors. Okay, now this is not 100% all the time going to be the way that every single thing works, but for instance, brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. I'm going to leave that in lowercase. You'll see why in just a minute. Okay, so if you have darker eyes or darker hair or darker skin color, a lot of times that is because you have that darker color dominant allele, and since you have it, it expresses and it covers up whatever sort of recessive allele might have been passed to you as well. Excuse me. All right. So scientists use a letter to represent each gene of an allele. The capital letter, capital B here, represents the dominant allele, while the lowercase letter represents the recessive allele. Lowercase b, recessive blue. Okay, so let's look at this description of peas. And so now that I'm talking about literal round English peas here, okay? This is where a lot of our studies in genetics actually started. On the next page, we'll get to talking about Mendel and his pea plants, but he was able to actually really trace a lot of our genetic knowledge through his experimentation with pea plants. A lot of our genetic knowledge starts with everything that he did, and it was just with pea plants. So when we start getting into reproduction, and when I start using words that have to do with reproduction, and you start feeling the need to giggle, I want you guys to remember that we are in fact talking about plants. All right, I'm going to say that again. before I have to bring it up. All right, so pea plants. We had here a dominant allele for roundness. That makes sense. Most of the peas that we see, if we have English peas fixed for dinner or as part of a casserole or something, they're round. They're little green, round vegetables. And so then here, this small r, the recessive allele, actually has them and sort of wrinkled and shriveled instead of nice and plump and round, okay? So he noticed that he could begin to predict which offspring peas would be round and which offspring peas would be wrinkly, and that the wrinkly ones got 2 copies, see here, 1 and 2 copies of that recessive gene for wrinkliness, okay? So if you have only 1 copy here, you will still see the dominant allele, but if you have 2 copies of the recessive allele, you will only see the recessive trait. I hope that this makes sense. If need be, please feel free to go back and listen to this video again, and go back and flip through the pages that I have also posted as reference material, because this will be the information that we're talking about pretty much from here till the end of school to finish up our biochemistry segment that we had agreed on. All right. So here, let's talk about genotype and phenotype. The definitions are on the next page. So here we go. We're flipping pages. All right. Now, when I talk about a genotype, I am talking about the actual genes of an organism. Okay? So if you were to actually look at someone's chromosomal makeup, if you were actually to sequence their DNA, that would be the genotype. Okay? So I'm going to write here also on the side genotype. And underneath, I'm going to put actual genes. Oh, almost fit. Almost fit. Try that again. Actual genes. Genes. Okay. And then here I have my other word that says phenotype. Okay. And that is how a thing looks. Phenotype. Phenotype. And so here underneath I'm going to write appearance. Case in point, I have been told in my life that I look a great deal like my mother, and that I have some of the features, though, specifically my eyes and my eye shape from my father. Okay? Now, those are comments on my phenotype. I also have curly hair, like some great granduncle something that came over from Ireland at one point in my family's history. Okay, again, phenotypes, right? This is how I look. This is a comment on my appearance, on what's actually expressed of my genetics. Now, has anybody ever taken my blood to see, oh, you do literally have the exact gene for your eye shape from your father, and you have this exact gene from your mother, and look here, there's this exact gene from your great granduncle who came over from Ireland? No, no one's actually done that. We don't know what my genotype is exactly for all of these physical outward appearance sort of traits. We don't know what genes these actually come from. This is just like a conversation that we've had, and it's kind of speculative. Okay, so if I'm talking about someone's appearance, they look this particular way, then I'm just talking about a phenotype. Okay, I'm just talking about how they present. And if I'm talking about an actual genotype, that means that I've got the information of exactly which genes were being recombined. So I'm speaking in a very specific way about it, not just how something may appear. Okay? So let's talk about these next two. They kind of look like gemstones. I really don't know what else to call them. All right, so we have homozygous and heterozygous. We talked about homogeneous and heterogeneous here when we did solutions. So again, I'm going to remind you that this one means different. D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, different. And homozygous over here, this one means same. Okay, so if I have two of the same genes expressed, so if I have double dominant or double recessive, both big letters or both little letters, if I have that genotype, that is what we call a homozygous genotype. They are the same, okay? But if I have one dominant and one recessive, they are different, and therefore we would call them a heterozygous genotype, okay? Big words, again, feel free, stop, go back. Maybe you need to stop and get a snack and come back in a little bit. Totally fine, okay? Again, this is a lot of information because we're going to be using it for a while. So, let's talk about good old Gregor Mendel, okay? He was actually a monk in Austria. So let me underline this right here. We talked about Austria. Austria-Hungary really, really in World War I, but let's not hold that against Gregor, okay? He didn't have anything to do with that. All right, so he was gardening in his monastery, in the place where the monks live, and he was noticing, as he was tending the pea plants, that the pea plants, as they would reproduce amongst themselves, that they would pass on traits like the color of their seeds, the color of their flowers, the shape and the color of their pods. He noticed that these plants were interacting with one another in such a way as to pass these traits on. So he was able to actually trace these changes, these traits being passed on. He was able to actually figure out which were going to be dominant and which were going to be recessive through several different generations, okay? So several different sets of parent pea plants and their offspring, all right? So it says here, listed on the next page, are Mendel's main ideas. Let's go to the next page. All right. So his idea here, so we've got 1, 2, 3 big ideas here. Okay, so here's number 1. Each trait is controlled by 2 genes called alleles. Okay, there's 2 copies that you get, and depending on which 2 copies you get, that will indicate which phenotype, which expressed trait you'll actually show. Okay, an allele can be either dominant or recessive. Okay, again, depending on which 2 copies you get, and depending on whether you have the dominant gene or not, or if you have 2 copies of the recessive gene, that's going to show what sort of trait is actually going to be expressed, and what's going to be part of your appearance or part of your behavior or what have you. Okay, here we go. We're not giggling, we're talking about plants, okay? All right, so when chromosomes separate during reproduction, each sex cell gets 1 allele for a trait. So when the sex cells of parents combine, the offspring randomly gets 1 allele from each parent. Okay, so let's look at this right here, this diagram. So mom here, we're going to, let's use the S for sweet. Okay, so big S will be sweet, little s will be sour, okay, And maybe we're talking about some sort of fruit here instead of a vegetable. Maybe we're talking about like a sweet cherry or a sour kind of tart cherry. Okay, so mom has one dominant sweet and one recessive sour. So when her chromosomes are dividing into the cells that they use for reproduction, it splits in half because she only gives one allele to her offspring. So she can either give the capital S sweet or she can give the little s sour. Okay, she's got two options. So this capital S sweet will go to one offspring, and then her lowercase s sour will go to one offspring. Now, Dad is not so lucky over here. He's only got sour, okay? Sour only. He is homozygous for the sour variant, okay? And so that means that's his only option. He can only give the sour allele to his offspring. So then this particular offspring takes a sour from both mom and dad, and so now this offspring ends up being a sour like dad. Now, if mom had been able to contribute her sweet gene instead of her sour gene, then that would have overridden dad's other sour gene, the only one he can give, and they would have created a heterozygous sweet offspring. All right, like mom here, she is heterozygous for the sweet variant. If you need a snack, please go get one and come back. Seriously, I completely understand. Pause, rewind, watch again. Totally fine. All right, Punnett squares. Let's talk about Punnett squares. Mendel, to do this sort of experiment, to track it through multiple generations, well, he had to keep really good records, right? He had to really know, okay, I'm tracking this gene from this parent, and I need to see, you know, the resultant offspring, and then when they start to make more plants, I need to check and see, you know, how this trait goes forward, or does it go forward? Is it passed on to the next generation? So Mendel had thousands of plants that he crossbred, okay? And he used a method like this Punnett square to actually figure out here the probability or the likelihood, I'm underlining that a particular plant would inherit certain qualities, okay? Here, big star. A Punnett square is a tool to figure out the probability that an offspring will express a certain trait. Okay, so again, let's look back up here with mom and dad that are sweet and sour, you know, cherries or fruit, something like that. Okay. On the next page, we're going to work out one that's heterozygous for tall, but I'm going to show you here with the traits that we've already talked about. Okay, let me see if I can get all this on the screen. Yep, looks like I can. Okay, so here we have mom, who has capital S and a little s, but then we have dad here across the top that only has little s, right? Okay, so mom, half of the time, will be able to pass on this dominant sweet gene, but the other half she'll have to pass on that recessive sour gene, and dad only has the ability to pass on the lowercase recessive sour gene. So we have here 50% of the time we'll have heterozygous sweet, and then the other 50% of the time we'll have homozygous sour. Okay? So if they are, if these two plants are next to each other and they pollinate each other and they continue to make more fruit and therefore more plants, then half of the time those plants that are made are going to be sweet. They're going to have that dominant sweet allele, and they're going to be able to produce the sweet fruit. But then half of the time they're going to only have 2 copies of the sour gene, and they'll only be able to make the sour fruit. Okay? So let's look here on the next page. We're talking about height now of plant. Okay? So here we have two parents who are both heterozygous for being tall, okay? So, and again, I'm talking about plants, okay? So this is a plant that has the option of either growing very tall or remaining very short and close to the ground, okay? So, but it prefers to grow tall. That is the dominant trait, okay? So, here we have parent number 1 across the top. Parent number 1 and parent number 2 here down the side. Okay, so in this first box, we have homozygous tall. Okay? In this other box here, we have homozygous short. Okay? Again, these alleles match, so they are homozygous. And then if you have both copies of the tall gene or both copies of the short gene, that's the only option you have. You will only ever express as tall or as short. Okay? But then we have these two here that make up the last 2 of the box, and that is heterozygous, because they're different. Heterozygous tall, because it will have the because it does have the tall gene, so that plant will express as being able to grow nice and tall. Okay, so let's talk about percentages and probabilities and stuff like that. I know I'm throwing a little bit of math in there, but hang on with me, okay? You can do it. All right, so homozygous tall, this first one is 1 square out of 4. Okay, my probability of getting a homozygous tall plant is 1 out of every 4, or 25%. Okay, same thing with the homozygous short. I still only am going to get that 1 out of every 4 plants, roughly, or 25% of the time. Okay, now this is not exact. Obviously, this is probability. This is likelihood. Nature doesn't go, oh, well, you know, you're the 5th plant, so I've got to start over with the genetics. Okay, it's not as exact as all of that, but it's just telling me what my odds are. Okay, it's telling me what the likelihood is. Now for this last one, heterozygous tall, I have 2 options to get it out of the 4, or 50% chance. So most of my plants are going to end up falling into this last category, the heterozygous tall, where they will have the tall gene that expresses itself. They will grow tall, but they do have the possibility to then pass on the short gene to their little offspring plants, whatever plant this is. Okay? All right. Also here, in terms of phenotype, this is down here at the bottom. These as far as expressed tallness that you would actually be able to see, plants that actually would grow tall, I would see 75% of these plants grow tall, and only 25% would remain short or close to the ground. Now, how do I know that? Okay, because if I have this, let me swap colors here. If I have this one here expressing as tall, that's 50%, and this one here also expressing as tall, that's another 25%. Those two together would give me 75% of my plants expressing as tall, whether they were only capable of being tall and only capable of passing on the tall gene, or whether or not they were just had the one dominant allele for being tall and potentially could create short offspring later on. Okay, and then here, big star right here. These only represent the probability or likelihood of each outcome. These parent plants that produced 4 offspring might not have exactly 3 tall and 1 short offspring. They might have 2 and 2 or 4 and 0, but plants that had 400 offspring would likely have around 300 tall and 100 short. Okay, once your sample size gets big enough, you would actually see it start to really hold true to that probability. But again, this is not an exact, this is exactly what will happen sort of prediction. Okay, so the same thing here occurs when we're trying to determine biological sex. Again, we are talking about plants, okay? Plants do also come in male and female variants, okay? So anything that reproduces using a male and a female, we refer to them as having a biological sex. Now here, the reason that is important is because we split into, as humans do, okay? Humans split in, we have 46 chromosomes. Oh, that's not going to fit. Let's try that again. All right, so humans, 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. And when we make those cells that eventually do turn into human offspring, then they each get 23 chromosomes. Okay? 23 chromosomes to offspring. Offspring. There we go. Because the male will contribute 23 and the female will contribute 23, and together they will have 46, and it will create, ideally, a whole person. Okay? So one of the things that gets passed down in a similar method to all other traits is the resultant biological sex of the plant or human or whichever creature you are discussing. So here is how this one works as well. The males can only give X's part of the time and Y's part of the time, and females can only give X's all of the time. Okay? So when you have a creature or a species that reproduces using this method, you have a 50% chance of male offspring and 50% chance for female as well. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say, well, it's a 50-50 shot. This is what we're talking about. 50-50. 50% of one, 50% of another. Okay? And so let's talk about stuff that's not as straightforward. And this is my last page of notes. You guys have been so patient with me. I appreciate it. Okay, so Gregor Mendel, he was able to figure out, okay, dominant and recessive. Things that show and things that don't show unless they're the only type of gene there. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So let's talk about complex inheritance. There are a lot of things that actually go into pigmentation and coloring in plants and animals, and there are a number of genes that work together. So it's not as simple as you get a gene for dark skin or a gene for light skin or whatever. There are lots of different genes that play into these sorts of coloring parts of our appearance, okay? And that, again, for all plants and animals. And so we'll find that sometimes, and I'm starting right here in this second paragraph, for some traits, one allele is not completely dominant and does not mask the recessive allele. Okay, so instead of being completely dominant, we'll have incomplete dominance. Or sometimes they'll be co-dominant, which means that they both express a little at the same time. Co-dominant, they're sharing that dominant sort of expression. Okay, so when we're talking about incomplete dominance, that just means that sometimes the, quote, recessive gene will show up, even if there is a dominant gene. And co-dominance will be like this example here. These kind of look like roses, but they just say flowers. So, so let's talk about co-dominance, okay? So we have a plant with red flowers, capital R, okay? Here, again, homozygous, dominant, all right? Now, we have this other plant with white flowers, homozygous, dominant, okay? So then, when we do the Punnett square, they all end up with a dominant red gene and a dominant white gene, but the result is pink flowers. Pink flowers 100% of the time? How does that work? Well, that right there is co-dominance, okay? Blending of red plus white phenotype. Okay, again, appearance, okay? So if we have this bush or this plant with the red flowers and it's planted nearby, or we crossbreed or cross-pollinate with the plant that has white flowers, we will receive in this particular from this particular plant, we will receive offspring plants that are 100% pink flowers, because they will blend with this red and white phenotype together into the resultant phenotype of having pink flowers because of the co-dominant trait. Let me put dots around there. All right. Okay. Well, I've got some questions that hopefully should be posting. And this one is almost as long as my first history one, so I'm going to let you guys go. But yes, so we will have easily over the course of the next few weeks, we will have probably 30 some odd questions over this material. And so if you guys will please don't feel bad about having to go back and watch this video again, listen to it again. Read over the pages again. They're posted, genetic reference material, and yeah. So this will finish us out. Thank you guys again for being so patient with me. I hope you have a great and wonderful day.